On April 21, 1975, more than 2,000 athletes gathered in the small town of Hopkinton, Massachusetts, preparing to compete in one of the most prestigious races on Earth. Among them was a 23-year-old man named Bob Hall. But unlike everyone surrounding him, Bob would not be running. He was sitting inside a modified hospital-style wheelchair, a heavy, inefficient machine that had never been designed for speed, endurance, or a 26.2-mile journey through the hills of Massachusetts. And Bob had been given a challenge. The organizers of the Boston Marathon had agreed to recognize his attempt, but only under one condition. He had to reach the finish line in less than 3 hours. Anything slower, and he would receive nothing. No official recognition, no finisher's certificate, and no proof that an athlete in a wheelchair truly belonged in the race. The Boston course was already difficult for the world's strongest runners. For Bob, every hill would have to be conquered almost entirely through the strength of his arms. And after nearly 3 exhausting hours, as the finish line finally came into view, Bob had almost no time remaining. What happened next would not only decide whether he finished the race, it would help determine who would be allowed to compete in marathons for generations to come. This is the story of Bob Hall, and the 2 minutes that helped transform an entire sport. Robert Joseph Hall was born in Cambridge, Massachusetts on October 31, 1951. When he was only 10 months old, he contracted polio. The disease severely affected his legs, and throughout his childhood, Bob underwent multiple operations intended to improve his mobility. The procedures helped him walk, but only with difficulty. He used braces and crutches, and one of the operations left his right ankle permanently fused. Still, Bob wanted to be involved in sports. He briefly played Little League Baseball, and later became a student manager for the football and basketball teams at Belmont High School. At the time, opportunities for athletes with disabilities were extremely limited. Organized adaptive sports existed, but they were rarely treated with the same seriousness, attention, or respect as conventional athletics. And competitive wheelchairs, as people know them today, did not exist. Athletes often competed in machines closely resembling the chairs found in hospitals, equipment designed to move patients through hallways, not to race at high speeds over long distances. But when Bob entered Boston State College, he began discovering that his physical limitations did not have to remove him from competition. Around this time, another athlete encouraged him to try wheelchair basketball. From there, Bob began experimenting with wheelchair racing, and almost immediately, he realized that he was good at it. He had upper body strength, he understood pacing, and more importantly, he possessed an unusual ability to keep pushing long after his body began telling him to stop. By 1974, Bob had become one of the strongest wheelchair athletes in the country. He won the National Wheelchair Mile. He won a National Wheelchair Marathon. And in Toledo, Ohio, he completed and won a full marathon. Bob had now proven that he could cover the distance. But there was one race that mattered more to him than any other, the Boston Marathon. It was held only a few miles from where he had grown up. It was the race he had heard about throughout his life, and Bob wanted the opportunity to compete, not as a spectacle and not as a ceremonial participant, but as an athlete. At that time, the Boston Marathon did not have a wheelchair division. There was no established procedure for an athlete like Bob to enter. 5 years earlier, in 1970, a Vietnam War veteran named Eugene Roberts had completed the Boston course in a wheelchair after beginning ahead of the official field. It took him more than 6 hours. His finish demonstrated that the distance was possible, but Roberts had not been recognized as an official Boston Marathon champion. So Bob decided to contact the race himself. He wrote to Boston Marathon director Will Cloney and asked for permission to participate. Cloney was hesitant. Allowing a wheelchair onto the course raised questions the organizers had never seriously considered. Would it be safe? Would the chair interfere with runners? And if they allowed Bob to participate, would they also have to admit bicycles, skateboards, or other wheeled equipment? But instead of simply rejecting Bob, Cloney offered him a challenge. Bob could attempt the course, and if he completed the entire marathon in less than 3 hours, he would receive an official Boston Athletic Association finisher's certificate. It was a demanding condition. A 3-hour marathon was a respectable performance even for an able-bodied runner. Bob would have to maintain an average pace of less than 7 minutes per mile, using equipment that was completely unsuitable for the task. But when Bob heard the condition, he accepted it. He did not need to be convinced. He believed he could do it. The wheelchair Bob planned to use was nothing like the specialized racing chairs seen in modern marathons. It had not been tested in a wind tunnel. It was not made from carbon fiber, and it had not been designed around Bob's body. It was essentially a hospital-style wheelchair that Bob modified himself. He cut the back lower so that his arms could move more freely. He angled the wheels to improve stability and handling, and he adjusted anything he believed might help him move faster. But there was only so much he could change. The chair remained heavy. Its shape created considerable resistance, and while modern racing chairs allow athletes to maintain streamlined positions, Bob would have to sit relatively upright and repeatedly force the wheels forward with his hands. Every mile would require thousands of pushing movements. His shoulders, chest, arms, wrists, and hands would perform nearly all the work. And there was another problem. Boston was not a flat race. The course began with long downhill stretches before eventually reaching the Newton Hills, including the climb now known around the world as Heartbreak Hill. Downhill sections could allow Bob to build speed, but they could also become dangerous in a chair never designed for racing. The uphill sections were even worse. A runner could shorten their stride and continue moving forward. Bob had to fight gravity with every push, preventing the chair from slowing or rolling backward while somehow conserving enough strength to complete the remaining miles. But by April of 1975, the chair was ready, or at least, it was as ready as Bob could make it. On the morning of the race, Bob's father drove him to the starting area in Hopkinton. Around him were thousands of runners preparing their shoes, stretching their legs, and waiting for the signal that would begin the journey toward Boston. Bob was the only athlete attempting the course in a wheelchair. There was no wheelchair field. There were no competitors beside him who understood exactly what he was about to experience. And there was no previous official finishing time for him to follow. All he had was the condition established by Will Cloney: 2 hours, 59 minutes, 59 seconds. That was the absolute limit. When the race began, Bob moved out with the runners. At first, the descending course worked in his favor. Gravity helped the chair gather speed, and Bob became part of the enormous pack traveling east toward Boston. But the advantages of the downhill sections would not last forever. The constant impact of the road traveled directly through the chair and into his body. Every imperfection in the pavement mattered. Every turn had to be controlled, and every burst of speed carried the risk of losing control of a machine that had never been designed to move that quickly. Still, Bob continued. Mile after mile, he pushed the wheels forward. The motion was repetitive, but the physical strain continued building. His arms were not merely propelling his body. They were moving the combined weight of Bob and the chair across the full marathon distance. There would be no moment when his legs could take over, no alternative muscle group he could rely on when his arms began failing. Once his upper body was exhausted, the race would effectively be over. And Bob later acknowledged that none of the miles were easy, but many of them were unforgettable. As Bob moved deeper into the course, the early descents gradually gave way to flatter roads. Then came Newton. Near the 18th mile, Bob turned onto Commonwealth Avenue and approached the section of the race that had broken countless runners. The Newton Hills stretched across several miles late in the course, when most competitors were already exhausted. For Bob, the challenge was mechanical as much as physical. On every incline, the wheelchair lost momentum. A few powerful pushes could move it forward, but the moment Bob reduced his effort, gravity began pulling against him. So he continued. Push, recover, push again. The crowds along the course watched as the only wheelchair athlete in the race fought his way uphill. Near the Newton Firehouse, spectators surrounded the road. Bob could hear their cheers. He remembered the noise, the people standing on poles and climbing into trees for a better view, and even the smells of cigars and food drifting through the air. And somewhere during that punishing section, Bob began thinking beyond his own race. He realized that other wheelchair athletes needed to experience this. The crowds were not treating him like a patient. They were not watching him as an act of charity. They were cheering for him as a competitor in the Boston Marathon. But Bob still had to finish, and Heartbreak Hill remained ahead. By then, his arms had already propelled him for approximately 20 miles. The muscles in his shoulders and chest were exhausted. His hands had repeatedly struck and gripped the wheels thousands of times. But stopping, even momentarily, would cost time he could not afford. Bob had not entered simply to prove that he could travel the distance. He had to break 3 hours, so he forced the chair upward. One push at a time, Bob reached the top of Heartbreak Hill, but despite its reputation, the race was not over. More than 5 miles remained between Bob and the finish line. After the Newton Hills, the course began descending toward Boston. Bob was exhausted, but the downhill roads allowed him to regain speed. He passed through Brookline and continued toward the city. By now, the 3-hour limit was approaching. Everything Bob had done, the training, the letter, the modifications, and more than 25 miles of pushing, had led to the final stretch. When the finish line finally appeared, Bob continued moving with whatever strength remained. And then, after 26.2 miles, his wheelchair crossed it. His official time was 2 hours and 58 minutes. He had beaten the deadline by approximately 2 minutes. Bob had not merely completed the marathon, he had fulfilled the condition. The organizers could no longer dismiss the attempt as a demonstration or an unofficial journey along the course. Bob had earned his certificate, and with that finish, he became the Boston Marathon's first officially recognized wheelchair champion. There was no enormous wheelchair division waiting behind him. There was no large prize, and Bob could not yet know how far the consequences of that finish would reach. But the barrier had been broken. For the first time, the Boston Marathon had officially recognized an athlete competing in a wheelchair, and once it had happened, it became far more difficult to argue that it should never happen again. Bob returned to Boston in the years that followed. In 1977, the marathon hosted the National Wheelchair Championship. This time, Bob was no longer alone. 7 wheelchair athletes entered the competition. Bob won again, completing the course in 2 hours, 40 minutes, and 10 seconds, nearly 18 minutes faster than his historic performance 2 years earlier. As he traveled over Heartbreak Hill, elite runners Bill Rogers and Tom Fleming slowed to encourage him. To Bob, that moment carried enormous significance. The runners were not treating the wheelchair athletes as outsiders who happened to be occupying the same road. They were fellow competitors, athletes recognized by other athletes. The Boston Marathon had now become the first major marathon to establish wheelchair competition, and as the division developed, more racers arrived. The chairs became faster, the athletes became more specialized, and finishing times began dropping dramatically. What had started with one man in a modified hospital chair was becoming an organized international sport. But progress in Boston did not mean wheelchair athletes were accepted everywhere. In 1976, Bob requested permission to enter the New York City Marathon. The organizers refused, and this time, Bob was not willing to accept the decision. He became involved in a legal fight to open the race to wheelchair athletes. The case moved through the courts for years. Bob and other racers were eventually allowed to participate, but the larger dispute over how wheelchair athletes should be included continued long afterward. At one stage, New York Mayor Ed Koch threatened to withdraw permission for the marathon itself unless wheelchair racers were allowed onto the course. For Bob, the issue had never been about receiving special treatment. It was about access. He believed that wheelchair racers trained like other endurance athletes, experienced the same pressure to perform, and deserved the opportunity to compete on the same roads. An official men's and women's wheelchair division would not be established in New York until 2000. But Bob's fight helped force the question into public view decades earlier. His competition was no longer restricted to the race course. He was now challenging the assumptions that decided who was considered an athlete in the first place. Bob also understood that permission to compete was only part of the problem. Athletes still needed better equipment. The hospital-style chairs used by early racers were heavy, difficult to control, and fundamentally unsuitable for high-speed competition. So in 1978, Bob founded a company called Hall's Wheels. He began creating handmade racing wheelchairs customized to fit individual athletes. Instead of forcing competitors to adapt themselves to standard hospital equipment, Bob built the equipment around the competitor. His chairs became lighter and more aerodynamic. They allowed athletes to sit in more efficient positions. And over time, racing chairs evolved from modified 4-wheeled machines into the low, streamlined 3-wheeled designs associated with the sport today. Some of Bob's custom chairs weighed only 14 to 16 pounds, approximately half the weight of the chair he had used in his first Boston Marathon. Athletes who followed Bob could now travel faster, corner more effectively, and push for times that had once appeared impossible. In 1980, Bob also joined runner and race director Dave McGillivray on a 1,520-mile journey from Florida to Boston to raise money for the Jimmy Fund. The trip took 38 days and ended at the Boston Marathon finish line. Bob was no longer simply participating in an emerging sport. He was helping construct it through competition, advocacy, engineering, and the opportunities he created for others. In April of 2025, Bob returned to the Boston Marathon. Exactly 50 years had passed since he crossed the finish line in 2 hours and 58 minutes. This time, he was not there to prove that he belonged. The Boston Athletic Association named him one of the race's grand marshals alongside Bill Rogers, the winner of the men's race in 1975. By then, nearly 1,900 wheelchair athletes had completed the Boston Marathon after him. The equipment had transformed. The competition had become professional. The fastest racers were finishing the course far quicker than Bob could have imagined while pushing his hospital-style chair through Newton. But none of it would have developed in quite the same way without someone being willing to go first. Bob never considered himself a hero. He said that he had simply attempted something he believed he was capable of doing. But the importance of his achievement came from the fact that he was not only racing for himself. Each mile provided evidence, each hill challenged an assumption, and when he crossed the finish line, he created a precedent that other athletes could build upon. On April 12, 2026, Bob Hall died after a long illness. He was 74 years old. In the days following his death, he was remembered as a champion, an inventor, an advocate, and the father of modern wheelchair racing. But perhaps the clearest representation of his legacy can still be seen every year in Boston. Before the runners reach the finish line, the world's fastest wheelchair athletes race through the city in specialized chairs descended from the equipment Bob helped develop. They compete for titles, they compete for prize money, and they are introduced not as inspirational guests or exceptions to the rules. They are introduced as elite athletes. 50 years earlier, Bob Hall had been given 3 hours to prove that one wheelchair racer belonged in the Boston Marathon. He finished in 2 hours and 58 minutes. And in doing so, he helped ensure that thousands of athletes would never have to prove it again. Bob Hall's story was never only about completing a marathon. It was about being given a standard that seemed nearly impossible, and meeting it so completely that the rules themselves had to change. Thanks so much for watching, and hopefully, I'll see you in the next one.